Oh, Suran is frozen again.
I'm saying I'm sure we can do that. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good, thanks.
I was going to say that I'm sure we can do that, but I'm nobody here, so my assurances doesn't mean anything.
Your word would override everyone else's.
Okay, it's 1 minute to 9. 1 minute to 9. 1 minute to 4.
Sorry, but
the attendees are already in the room. I think when I switched over host to Sepida, it changed like that. So we can. So Prof, when you're ready, then.
Len, were you saying you wanted to start first? I mean,
yeah. If Prathama doesn't mind.
I'm fine. I'm totally fine.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. I just hope my Wi-Fi is going to hold something. Seems not great about it today. But okay. Is Behrooz there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, there you. Okay. All right. So when you're ready, Ali.
We can.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you, Ali.
We can start now. It's 4 o'clock. Okay. Good luck. Bye.
Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the 5th in our series of Other Universal seminars. We are delighted to have you all join us again today. And in our last seminar, we had a fascinating conversation about revolutions and hopes and tragedies on the Marxist left in Lebanon. And today we continue in some ways with this conversation, albeit in a very slightly contiguous but different part of the world, inhabiting a certain kind of predicament, I suppose, that many of us in the project and across this consortium have shared with each other. And with a deep interest in the particular and specific histories of the places of the world that have been connected through both revolutionary experiences, but also, of course, the tragedies and fates of those revolutionary experiences. So I welcome today our speaker, and what I'm going to do is just go through the short bios of our 3 speakers today, and then hand over to Behrooz for his presentation. So Professor Behrooz Ghamari-Tabrizi is Professor of Near Eastern Studies and Director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. He holds a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of California in Santa Cruz, and he's the author of 3 books on different aspects of the historical context of the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and its aftermath. The one titled Islam and Dissent in Post-Revolutionary Iran. The other, the one that we will be talking about today, Foucault in Iran, Islamic Revolution After the Enlightenment, published in 2016. And in also, did I get that right? And also Akbar, Inside the Iranian Revolution, also published in 2016. He has co-edited a special issue of Radical History Review on the Iranian Revolution on its 30th anniversary, published by Duke University Press, and has published a series, a wide-ranging series of essays and articles on the topic. He's also currently working on a project titled Mystical Modernity, a comparative study of philosophy, of history and political theory of Walter Benjamin and Ali Shariati. Our discussants today, whom we're very honored to have with us, Professor Pratima Banerjee, is a historian at the Center for the Study of Developing Society, CSDS in Delhi. And she's the author of Politics of Time, Primitives and History Writing in Colonial Society in 2006. And her new book, fresh, or in the press, we should say, coming out in next month, Elementary Aspects of the Political Histories from the Global South is forthcoming. Her research interests are political philosophy, literary theory, and the history of concepts. Our next discussant, Professor Lynn Osomi, is a senior research fellow at the Makerere Institute for Social Research. Her research and teaching focus on politics and feminist political economy, with specializations in gendered labor, land and agrarian studies, the modern state, and the political economy of gendered violence. And she's the author most recently of Gender, Ethnicity, and Violence in Kenya, Transitions to Democracy, States of Violence, and co-editing of the forthcoming volume, Labor Questions in the Global South. And I'll take this opportunity just to also notify, of course, Professor Banerjee and Osome that we will be inviting them to speak in our seminar series next year. Hopefully, maybe not on Zoom, but in person. But we will see how that goes. So let me now hand over to Behrooz, who will speak to the themes in the book that we've pre-circulated sections of. Behrooz.
Okay. Thank you so much, Suren. I was just telling everyone how much I love Cape Town and how much I hate traveling there. So the travel is long from the US. So I'm glad that I can sort of be there by not being there in this day and age. I also wanted to thank Sepide Azari and Ali Khan for their hard work putting these events together. And I know how much logistical work it takes to put these things together, and I really appreciate that. And again, I would also like to thank Professor Banerjee and Osome for agreeing to participate in this conversation. I know that we are all busy in these pandemic days, and how ironically, actually, our commitments to varieties of engagements have grown exponentially these days. So extra thanks to both of you. I was invited to a book conversation at the Iranian National Archive and Library a couple of weeks ago, and one of the discussants who really didn't like my book, this was on the occasion of the third edition of Farsi translation of the book, and he said that how painful it was for him to read the book. I'm just hoping that I didn't inflict any pain on those of you who read parts of the book and to come here today. So if I did inflict any pain, I apologize. And this is, and also before I start, I realize that this is kind of exhaustive to listen to a monologue through this digital medium, and I hope that we can wrap this part of our event quickly, and then we get into conversation and discussion. For the most part, I wrote Foucault in Iran as a point of departure for a conversation on historiography and epistemological questions about ways of knowing. These questions tread at the trajectories of memory, history, ideology, conceptual commitments to the ways of understanding the world. And I believe these are the kind of questions that both Professors Osome and Banerjee engage in their own works as well. This book is not to determine whether Foucault or any other observer of the revolution was right or wrong, but to examine how they reached the conclusions through an exercise of writing history of the present. This, of course, does not mean that I am or Foucault was ambivalent about the ontological questions about what the revolution was and what it meant, or that I look at politics exclusively from an stoic position without regards to real consequences of political action. The book also highlights the contingent core of historical change, the idea that history does not unfold, it is made. It draws attention to the constitutive link between writing history and making history. In the first chapter, I tried to demonstrate these points through retelling of the emergence of the revolutionary movement in 1977-78. There I argued that revolutionary movement demonstrated a desire to be included in history in order to exit it. This seemingly paradoxical view points to the way that I thought the movement in Iran operated at the threshold of a novelty, exceptional in the clarity with which they rejected the Shah and deeply reluctant to exercise that insurgent subjectivity within the conventions of temporality that had hitherto defined revolutions. Revolutions do not mark instances of the unfolding of a historical telos. Rather, they make history the subject of their actions. I do recognize that this type of historiography generates certain political anxieties that stem from the disappearance of a universal referent. Every February, around the time of the anniversary of the revolution, members of the parliament, government officials, military commanders, and scholars with diverse theoretical proclivities revisit the core demands of the revolutionary movement with new claims about the true meaning of the revolution. Why did the revolution happen? What was it all about? A reminder that the meaning of the revolution remains a contested field, even and more significantly among its winners. That partly explains why, unlike other world historical moments, the conventional history of the Iranian Revolution was written not by those who reigned after the revolution, the victors, but by the defeated, those who failed to join the post-revolutionary power. Foucault set aside the questions of causality and historical inevitability and highlighted the significance of the revolutionary experience. How did it change subjects' relationship to themselves and to others? In one of his earlier notes on revolutionary situation in Iran, he situated the soul of the uprising in a series of questions that Iranians must have asked themselves. And I quote Foucault here. Of course, we have to change this regime and get rid of this man. We have to change this corrupt administration. We have to change the whole country, the political organization, the economic system, the foreign policy. But above all, we have to change ourselves, our way of being, our relationship with others, with things, with eternity, with God must be completely changed. And there will only be a true revolution if this radical change in our experience takes place. And end of quote. He understood this change as a spiritual transformation, a rupture that had a literal and corporeal meaning in a real Foucauldian inversion, the unforeseen liberation of the body from the prison house of the soul. The spirituality he witnessed in Iran offered a fracture in otherwise ubiquitous techniques of governmentality about which he had written for most of his career. I wanted to underscore the singularity through which an expansive transformative politics with its distinct Shi'i Islamic revolutionary expression unfolded during the uprising. The emphasis on that singularity of the revolutionary experience leads, rightly so, to the problem of solidarity. How emancipatory movements remain singular, yet connected across political, cultural, civilizational, and historical differences. I interpret the singular or particular not as a concept in contradistinction to universal. Rather, singularity here denotes a conjunctural assembly of events, processes, and historical patterns that form a distinct instance of individual and collective transformation. A transformation informed and conditioned by universal material and subjective realities in particular temporal and spatial trajectories. Rather than a designation of authenticity, singularity here marks the manifestation of situated universality, the way it is embodied in a revolutionary action and ideology. In that sense, solidarity emerges through the recognition of those temporal and spatial trajectories, not despite of them, through a privileged imperial position. Not only is such recognition significant in a transnational context, but also, and more importantly, it is the very foundation of a revolutionary movement in any society. Solidarity works through mutual recognition, organically in a true Gramscian sense, through the formations of particular historical blocks. In the retelling of the narrative of revolutionary movement, I tried to show how the movement that Foucault called irreducible to the interests of or positions of any specific class, political party, or social group was already deeply diverse. Multiple sources of political, philosophical, religious, and historical inspirations informed that diversity. As a revolutionary ideology, Islamism was considerably influenced by Marxism, postcolonialism, existentialism, non-allied and national liberation movements. The same was true for Iranian Marxism that was articulated and practiced in a highly specific Shi'i nationalist context. Solidarity is already embedded in the type of singularity that I highlighted in the book. Singularities that are transformable, transferable, and transmissible. The three T's that I'm going to ask you at the end what the three T's were. Transformable, transferable, and transmissible. A number of critics have read Foucault's identification of something distinctive in the uprising that transcended class, gender, ethnicity, and other differentiating affinities as an Orientalist misgiving, especially given the difference this view presents with respect to his earlier arguments about the heterogeneous character of instances of resistance. While that might be true, it is worth remembering that Foucault viewed the unity he witnessed in Iran as a fleeting moment, something extraordinary and provisional that was not achieved through intersection between various groups. and I quote Foucault here, something different has happened. A phenomena has traversed the entire people and will one day stop. There is no doubt that one can sense an anti-Occidentalism in Foucault's reading of the Iranian Revolution. In much of his oeuvre on the history of ideas, disciplinary regimes, and regulative systems of governmentality, Foucault often explicitly reminds his readers of the Western specificity of his subject. He defined his projects invariably as studies of Western subjects. His project has always been to dispense with things, to borrow here from Ian Almond, to depresentify them. I don't know whether that's a word or not, to depresentify them. The point for Foucault is relating things to the body of rules that enable them to constitute the conditions of their historical appearance. In that sense, Foucault's anti-Occidentalism does not construe the West in a state of alienation and inauthenticity, the inverse of which one might locate the Orient. One would be hard-pressed to imagine that kind of nostalgic view of the Orient coming from one of the most important philosophers of historical understanding of alterity. The underpinning assumption in social movement theories was and continues to be that the Iranian Revolution and the ensuing social movements represent an anti-movement or a regressive utopianism. Key figures of social movement theory brushed aside the conceptual, political, and historical significance of these movements by simply and indiscriminately conceptualizing them as a uniform, in the words of the Italian sociologist Alberto Melucci, mythical, and I quote him, mythical quest for the lost paradise, which crystallized into fanatic fundamentalism. What I discussed as a problematic in the feminist intervention in 1979 in Tehran lies in the way the activists launched their mission in Iran based on similar assumptions. In the chapter on women's movement, the feminist politics, I offer a detailed account of how Iranian women and their spokespersons articulated their own manifold and intricate objections to their own mobilization against the new restrictions imposed upon women in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. Western feminists who declared solidarity with Iranian sisters displayed an ungenerous curiosity about the specificities of the movement and the kind of singularity that generated that particular post-revolutionary event. The chapter on women's movement shows how Western feminists failed to recognize the intersectional core of that movement and the complex ways in which anti-colonialism, class, culture, gender, and identity politics converged with all their intensity 3 weeks after one of the most popular revolutions in world history. People who look into these issues on history of revolutions all agree that the Iranian Revolution was the most populist revolution in world history, because if you compare Iranian Revolution with French, Russian, Chinese revolutions, for example, in French Revolution, only around 2% of the entire population was directly involved in the revolution. Russian Revolution is 1.5%. The Iranian Revolution was around between 10 to 15%, depending on whether you focus on urban or rural areas. So 10 times bigger in terms of participation than the French Revolution. I believe no effective politics could be articulated without the recognition of the intersectionality that generated that historical moment. I do not believe that the recognition of an intersectional singularity should be understood as an isolationist stance. As Kimberly Crenshaw and other critical race and post-colonial feminists have established, an intersectional approach is a necessary way of adding complexity to relations of power and showing how systems of inequality and oppression operate on multiple terrains. It is a position against speaking of a universal emancipatory politics from a privileged transhistorical standpoint. I do recognize the deep political relevance of such epistemological claims and how moments such as women's protests in Iran inevitably generate animated responses and impassioned debates. By no means do I advocate the silencing of voices by be they secular, bourgeois, exilic, working class, anti-imperialist, Muslim, or liberal. I do raise questions, however, about those who believe that they speak from the position of historical inevitabilities, that they embody the progressive logic of history. Indeed, with fears of beating a dead horse, I will reinstate that it is the very linearity as a mode of understanding history that is at issue. One of the most misinterpreted concepts in Foucault's philosophical contemplations on the Iranian Revolution is his notion of political spirituality and the way I link that notion to the ethics of the care of the self. The question here is that how something seemingly individual turned into collective political action in Iran. I doubt that there could possibly be a persuasive answer to that very important question. As Foucault observed in one of the most passionate passages in his reportage, and I quote Foucault here, "The man in revolt is ultimately inexplicable. There must be an uprooting that interrupts the unfolding of history and its long series of reasons why, for a man really to prefer the risk of death over the certainty of having to obey." Even more mystifying, and that was the end of the quote, even more mystifying is how that transformation takes the shape of a collective revolutionary action. In my first book, I discussed how important it was to defend the notion of utopia and argue that a society dispossessed of the narrative skill to envision alternative political, economic, and cultural relations is dead. But more importantly, inspired by writings of Ernst Bloch, I realized that the conception of utopia ought to be linked to the not yet become of folklore in the popular desire to hope and strive for a better life expressed in myth, fairy tales, and daydreams. The 20th century witnessed a repeated perversion of revolution. Revolution increasingly became associated with terror and totalitarianism rather than with hope and emancipation. From a highbrow philosophical assertion, the end of history turned into an everyday reality that colonized the very essence of imagination and revolutionary thinking and acting. The ability to transcend the present and to think of the world anew appeared to be a story, the end of which we already knew, so we were told, as the first act was unfolding. Despite restoring faith in the possibility of change, every revolution that once stood at the threshold of a novelty failed to realize the kind of imaginations and desires that had given rise to them. In every instance, the realpolitik of existing possibilities colonized the imaginative spirit through which the demands for change were articulated. And my friends in South Africa can relate to that very directly. In its earlier conceptions, revolution was not yet ossified in the realization of a new historical epoch, the blueprint of which was already drawn. More care and credibility was given to a more playful and imaginative understanding of history that connected the experiences of life in the past to the possibilities of the future. Recently, I've become more interested in the kind of ambiguities and uncertainties that problematize seeing revolutions as a fulfillment of progressive inevitabilities. I found myself gravitating more towards seeing the Iranian Revolution as an instance of what Walter Benjamin calls a leap towards the sky of historical possibilities. Marx saw revolutions as the locomotive of history. But perhaps things are different, as Benjamin warns us. It may be that revolutions are the act by which the human race traveling on the train applies the emergency brake. That gripping image suggests that if humanity allows the train follow its course already laid down by the steel structure of the tracks, we shall hurled into catastrophe, the crash, or the abyss. I believe that the Iranian Revolution case encourages us to see revolutions as a moment of a pause rather than acceleration of historical time, a moment of reflection on the progressive temporalities that operate as a second nature in modern times. And I stop here, and again, I apologize for the long monologue, but again, thank you, and I'm curious to hear comments from Pratama and Lynn.
Thank you, Behrooz. I'm going to hand over now to Lynn, but just before I do, to remind participants that we will take questions in the Q&A. So if you have questions at the end of the discussant's presentations, we will go through them on the Q&A. Thank you. Lynn.
Okay. Thank you, Behrooz. I enjoyed reading the book. When Suren first asked me to be a discussant, my first reaction was, but I'm not a Foucauldian scholar. I didn't tell him that. But I got into the book, and it deals with a lot of issues I'm also thinking about. And I found it quite provocative. So thank you. I want to I have about 5 or 6 questions or reflections. One is on the question of legibility, which you point to as a persistent organizing discourse of modernity. And one of the questions to which you seem to be responding in this regard is whether it is possible to convey transformative events as being transformative, if not through reference to the foundational Enlightenment texts which some revolutions exceed. And to this question, your response seems to be yes. So you're pointing us to the struggle over and around history. In the way that you're framing it, one is either a historical subject, making history and shaping the narratives to come, or they are a subject of history, conforming with history's onward march, where history here is a history of the West. And this is the note on which you've ended your talk. And so, considering the feminist subject, I confess that majority of what I'm going to talk about is a bit on the introduction, but mainly on your chapter 4, which is also the longest chapter in the book. And I take that to mean that you attribute particular significance to it. So considering here the feminist subject, which preoccupies your chapter 4, the question to which you seem to be responding is whether women are possible as historical subjects, shaping, challenging, and creating their fates, or are permanently destined to be understood as subjects of patriarchal, sexist, dominant, misogynistic histories and narratives. And those histories, those patriarchal and so on histories, are then what necessitate their actions as resistors, right? So in other words, outside of the framing or the framework of revolutionary action, how, and this is the question, if we are thinking of women or this feminist subject, is it even possible to think of them outside of the framework of revolutionary action? How and who would you consider as a feminist subject? In a sense, are women legible? How do you deal with, are they legible outside of if women are not doing anything, do they matter? In a sense, that's what I'm asking. And secondly is of course, another big theme in your book, which is the universal versus particularist histories. You show that language, the language that we are handed that make protest legible, which is the language of rights, the language of the Enlightenment, the language of rights, freedom, equality, economic, and so on. And also, they also become tools for universalization, such that protest itself can be legitimized only if it can represent some kind of global or universal desire for freedom. And therefore, without the possibility of this kind of travel, right, protest is rendered ahistorical, acontextual, apolitical. These are fun, I'm quite convinced with, for example, Wendy Brown's critiques around rights, and this is one of the ones that she develops quite a bit, how rights function without any inherent political semiotic. So outside of their context, they become they become ahistorical, they become decontextualized and even depoliticized. So a core argument then that you're making, that in their critique, those who critiqued Foucault's reading of the revolution, they appeal to a universalist, a universal and a reductionist sense of womanhood, without regard to the contingencies of post-revolutionary power struggles. This is one of your core arguments. The exception the thing that generates unease and disgust is that the perpetuators do not legitimize their actions within the Enlightenment rationalities, right? This is what irritates those who critique Foucault. And of course, this question, this circles back to the question of legibility, that any act of freedom or resistance that defies or escapes the lexicon of Enlightenment rationality is to be dismissed, is to be diminished, punished, caricatured, and of course, exceptionalized, right? But I think, and this is my question, I think that this disavowal is linked to a question of power. And I know you deal with it, it's just not clear to me how you deal with it. This disavowal, if you're not thinking within Enlightenment rationality, then you're dismissed, but this dismissal is linked to a question of power to the extent that recognition, and you dealt with this a bit in your talk just now, recognition or the failure to do so, to recognize, I think is always an enactment of power, such that even a failure to recognize is still an insistence on one power over the other, those who are defined as other. So how in this regard would you deal with the power that strides, this space between the universal and the particular in terms of, the kind of desire for freedom that you're trying to pull us to. And third is the question of women and feminism and modernity, or the thematic. And in the text, so I was very struck by many of there's a lot of really good empirical stuff in that chapter. And in that text, you show how feminists and women, and especially, they seem to be elite women, who are the major opponents, of this kind of Foucault's, political spirituality, which to them appears as a romanticism born of a lack of deep knowledge of the scriptures through which post-revolutionary politics are translated. So in this sense, is feminism inescapably modern in the sense that there is no possibility of reading women's liberation outside of the purview of the Enlightenment? Foucault's critics, his critics identified in the post-revolutionary power struggle, particularly in the form of gender politics and the imposition of new restrictions on women's mobility. They identified this as an instance of the fallacies of abandoning Enlightenment rationality and its immutable universal reference. So in ways that center women as kind of quintessential subjects of modernity, or of the struggle over its discontents. In a sense, through and through, on every side you look, and I think this is the fascinating thing about this chapter, because the struggle over femininity, over the feminist subject becomes, what defines the limits of modernity itself, of this Enlightenment thinking and how it thinks of freedom. So in what ways would you engage such a notion, this idea of women as deeply interpolated by modernist and Enlightenment ideas of freedom and justice and equality, but at the same time are situated at the margins that define culture, tradition, family, nation, which again you also speak to. And so I think that what I'm trying to ask is, what is the core, what is at the core of your instinct to rescue the Iranian women revolutionaries from Enlightenment rationality? What is at stake for you? And fourth, Suren, you let me know when my time is almost up. I don't know how long I have. Fourth is the question of American imperialism and the woman question. So there you also deal, the overarching concept of anti-imperialism, of accusations of westernization, or for that matter, Islamization, mean that they meant that women cannot be understood as subjects on their own. Women are either read in opposition to a secular political inclination or as conforming to religious signifiers of piety, right? They are denounced in equal measure by the Islamic militant and by the radical secular. But where does the possibility lie, if at all, of understanding the terms of women's actions on their own? So in this regard, I guess I'd like you to reflect a bit more on, because you frame the book around, the idea of conditions of possibility. That's how you're thinking of this revolution and its particularity. So what would you say these were in 1979 that enabled the widespread and revolutionary participation of women? And I know this is a big question. It's probably too broad. And second last is of course the most irritating but interesting, the Kate Millett's The Orientalist Gaze, right? Her Orientalist gaze on Iranian women, which made me reflect a lot, obviously, on the political question of internationalism and the way in which its limits only become apparent in the social and political context in which solidarity is enacted. So there's a very clear sense in which you show the elitist character of the feminist internationalist solidarity that marks the post-revolutionary period. The lack of innocence and the utter discontent, the utter disconnect between women's grounded struggles and the projection of these struggles to the world. So more to the point, in the end, where you speak of, I think, Goli Dari, I don't know if I'm getting that right. I think it's on page 152. You seem to be suggesting that the true line between local and international tradition, modernity, secular, religious, is around the question of class. That to understand the women's issue is to examine truly and understand the wretched among women. In quotes, just to quote you, whose highest hopes are for more food, more income, more than a single room in which to live out her life. These are the common goals of that majority. Is this a misreading of your intention? So, and in a sense, could you speak more broadly to the way in which you treat class, if at all, in your overall analysis in this book? And lastly, in the final section of the chapter, you seem to turn, ironically, you seem to return or reach back for the very indices of modern progress that you have sought to critique, to show that Iranian women have struggled against their oppression. So education, all these matters, you turn to them. Again, that's what you're telling us. You know, what is it truly, and against the grain of the Enlightenment, what is it that shows women as historical subjects rather than as subjects of history, based on your substantive critiques in this chapter? I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And I think you were also joined by the Maribut Stoke of Makerere University in the background. Let me hand over to Pratima.
Hi. So Suren, thank you very much for letting me join this wonderful conversation. And Behrooz Sahab, let me begin by simply saying how much I enjoyed and learned from your book. I'm fully persuaded by your main proposition, namely that the Iranian Revolution was to Foucault what the Haitian Revolution was to Hegel. That Foucault's intellectual journey from a study of forms of power to a hermeneutics of the self was most likely propelled by his experience of political spirituality in Iran. I'm also entirely with you in the revisionist move that you make in creating a new canon of world-changing events, a new canon of revolutions for us to draw legacy from. The original canon was, of course, the American, French, Russian, and as an afterthought, the Chinese. But people like Susan Buck-Morss, you have opened up that canon of events and overturned it in a very, very productive way. And I'm really, really excited by the direction that your work is taking. I'm also persuaded and excited by how much you make of the concept of political spirituality. You clearly say that political spirituality is more than mere resistance or rebellion. It's a mode of becoming that seeks to make history against the logic of history, as it were. It's about becoming other than oneself, a potentiality that cannot be accounted for by historical necessity or causal logics. Now, your formulation about political spirituality in Iran greatly resonates with my own work with late 19th and 20th century South Asian materials. In fact, it seems to me that in my part of the world, the very idea of equality was fashioned in modern times, and this is crucial, in modern times, as a spiritual idea. Only later reduced in historiography, though never fully tamed, I must say, by the logic of economic reason. Now, not just Gandhi, who is seen as an exceptional figure because of his vociferous critique of modernity and his commitment to spiritual labors, but also figures like B.R. Ambedkar, master constitutionalist and leader of the ex-untouchables, and counterintuitively, a great number of socialists and communists thought in spiritual and religious terms in the 20th century about equality. In fact, and I want to share this with you, and you might already know it really, Islam was critical to radical peasant politics in Eastern India as it evolved into a mode of everyday subaltern piety and industry, while also being the language of insurgency and martyrdom. In fact, and this is something that I discuss in my own work, it was through the mediation of popular Islam, with its stories of Ghazis and warrior saints, that Marxism took root here and was transformed in critical ways. Then again, in northern India, we have had the poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who made a critique equally of jurisprudential Islam and Sufi mysticism, in a way reminding us of Ali Shariati, whom you write so beautifully about in your own book. Iqbal spoke of khudi, a poetic self that by playing with time and rising up against history, as it were, achieved not only a creative freedom, but also political power, sultanate, akin to God's own. One of Iqbal's famous poems, very well known, was a dialogue between Lenin and Allah. And not just Islam, traditions of non-dualist philosophy, as well as Buddhist ideas of the void and the impermanence of being, were equally mobilized for the cause of equality and revolution in the name of the poor, the untouchable, and sometimes even the non-human. In other words, I want to join you in saying that political spirituality as a concept and as a palpable, tangible phenomenon has a far wider remit in modernity than is acknowledged in either liberal or Marxist thought. This leads us to question, as you do yourself in the book, the modern binaries of religion versus secularism, individual versus community, self versus society, and such like. I believe it also compels us to reopen and rethink the very concept of the political, as also what we see today as the standard canon of political philosophy. I want to hear your thoughts on how we must rethink the political as such, if once we take political spirituality, and which is not to be confused with the other term that is now become popular, which is political theology, a la Carl Schmitt and his interlocutors in later times. Now, I'm entirely with you in your Foucauldian understanding of political spirituality as a fashioning of the self's relationship to itself. Here is a telling example that I can give from a late 19th century non-dualist critic of caste in southern India, somebody called Sri Narayana Guru, who consecrated mirrors as idols in temples, forcing the devotee to gaze unto herself so as to generate a second order consciousness in the subject about the sheer contingency of one's own embodiment, one's identity. And yet, it also strikes me that this meditation, this meditation on the self is inevitably animated by the figure of a paradigmatic other, of one who is different and yet equal. My reading of diverse forms of political spirituality in South Asia tells me that it is in the relationship to the absolute other, of which, of course, the epitome is God himself, absolute alterity, without promise of equivalence or commensurability, that spiritual insight becomes indispensable to the imagination of equality. This other is a contingent figure, This other may be another community, another gender, even another species. That is, I would argue that in contexts where understanding, even recognition, become impossible, where recognition cannot be taken for granted, that spirituality becomes imperative to fashioning equality and unity. So many Islamic thinkers in South Asia, for instance, mobilize the concept of the unity of being, Tawheed or Wahadat ul Wujud, in order to ascribe intentionality, animation, and potential to even non-humans, to nature, as they would often say, rendering multiple species thinkable as equals, even when they do not understand each other. In other words, political spirituality, I feel, and again, I want to pick your brains on this, is a negotiation of unmitigable otherness, rather than only a cultivation and ethics of the self. I wanted to hear your thoughts on how the self-other, friend-enemy binaries of modern political thought come to be transformed if we take political spirituality seriously. How does a hermeneutics of the self stage, or does not stage, if you will, a constitutive other? Now, I hear you as saying, and this is the other point that I want to make in response to your almost poetic presentation, I must say, in great appreciation. I hear you as saying that insight derives from thinking across multiple traditions, histories, temporalities. Insight is not auto-generated. It is necessarily a product of encounters. So Foucault cannot be contained within a pure, uncontaminated, canonical Western European tradition of philosophy. There is no Foucault without Iran, as it were, in your words. Now, would you say that Iran has a special or an exclusive place in Foucault's thought? What about his engagement with Japan, with Zen Buddhism? What about his sojourn in Tunisia? Now, I completely get the difference that you have with those like the feminist scholar of Algeria, Marina Lazreg, and so on, who reduce Foucault's engagement with other societies as yet another instance of Orientalism. I completely understand, and you said that even more clearly in your presentation than you do in the book. And here I want to draw into the invocation of legibility and illegibility that Lynn kind of emphasized. What is the place in Foucault's oeuvre, Foucault being as much a theoretician of knowledge as of power, so much so that in his work the two are indistinguishable? What is the place of not knowing, unknowing, the delving into another society, another culture, the illegibility, the inexplicability of a moment of insurgency, an Islamic tradition which Foucault does not really know? And you talk of Fanon also in your book, who studies Algeria without really knowing, without the language, the society. What is the place of the leap into the unknown in revolutionary thought, particularly salient to a theoretician of knowledge such as Foucault? I found that a very, very interesting question to raise in context of your book. Just again, what do you think? What are your thoughts? And finally, excuse me, at the very end of your book, you make a passing statement about Foucault's silence. His silence about the critical intellectual work that Iran does for his thought. A silence akin to Hegel's own silence about real life and real-time slavery informing his conception of the master-slave dialectic. I wanted to push you a little more about how you read this silence in terms of the politics of knowledge, which is exactly what your book is about, the politics of knowledge. I remember here the fantastic work done by the media scholar Laura Marks when she traces in her essay aptly called The Deleuzian Ijtihad, the sources of Deleuze's philosophy. She argues that Ibn Sina's work traveled via Duns Scotus and Leibniz to Deleuze, as did, she later argues in her book, Islamic atomism, the Asharite school, via pointillism to later digital art. Ibn Sina, according to her, centrally informed Deleuze's conceptions of the university of being, of the virtual, and of becoming. She then argues that the coherence and consistency of the European philosophical tradition, including major and minor philosophers, as Deleuze classified them himself, is founded on a violent erasure of intellectual borrowings and translations across traditions. So Ibn Rushd could be co-opted, as Ali Shariati knew, and he'll show that, but Ibn Sina could not be, if European philosophy had to remain European, or at least ultimately, even though tenuously tied to classical Greek thought, despite its Arabic detours. Would you then say that Foucault's silence is not entirely benign in terms of the modern politics of knowledge? I think I will just rest here. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pratima. I think, Behrooz, you have quite a bit to chew on there. Perhaps respond as you wish to.
Yeah. Thank you so much. These are, I mean, I have to say out front that I think I really won't be able to respond properly to questions and comments, and because partly because I don't know how to, and partly it's partly these are kind of questions that I'm constantly struggling with, and so unfortunately I can't offer you a persuasive or definitive answer to these questions. But I wanted to think along with you on these questions, and particularly as Lynn put it at the center of her comments and questions on the question of legitimity and language, because I think one can read the question of legitimity in two different ways. One is through the question of language, which is, I think, is quite important part of that conversation. And the other thing about legitimity is the question of points of references. And both of them actually work together in a sense. because language, as we know, cannot operate without those points of references. And it's a cultural kind of system in itself. And partly also that these points of references have so much to do with the other point that Lynn and also Pratama, you also raised, the question of the structures of power. Because without those structures of power, we can't even have a conversation about points of references, because it's how power operates by establishing a universe of points of references, or in sort of Foucauldian language, an episteme. An episteme is a ways that we make conversation possible, and making conversation possible is not an innocent thing at all. I mean, it's a very, if basically it is about entering a network and relation of power. And so in that sense, I think the question of legitimity is very, very central to this conversation. And how we can deal with this question is something that I unfortunately can't offer an answer to. And it's and except with saying that we need to engage in these kinds of instances that points of reference and the question of language are contested, and create a network of empirical interconnectivity to engage and challenge that kind of points of reference argument. And I always say that I really don't consider myself to be a theorist, and I consider myself to be someone who's really interested in thinking about empirical realities outside their already formed theoretical constructs. And I sort of kind of hope that I could communicate that in this book, because I go back and forth into laying out a landscape of events and empirical evidence to challenge those frames in which those empirical instances are understood. So in that sense, I'm not really smart enough to sort of transcend those empirical things and say, okay, now I'm thinking about the world in conceptual terms. This is something that Hegel does. This is something that Kant does. So I have to be very realistic about my own capacities. And so in that sense, I can't offer an answer in general to the question of legitimacy, only to say that let's be more empirical. And so it might be a bit more counterintuitive to say that, but that's how I engage with that question. And then to see actually how these moments of empirical, heuristic, everyday life, quotidian practices problematize and generate new points of references in their action, in their experience, in their practice. And we have a number of interesting cases now, especially since Lynn, you brought up the question of the feminist subject, of these kinds of engagements, like in Saba Mahmoud's work. I just, yesterday, I had this wonderful conversation with my friend and colleague Niloufar Ha'eri on her new book on prayer and poetry groups in Iran, women's poetry and prayer groups in Iran. And these are kind of spaces that if you think conceptually about modern subject, you can't find a space to define these spaces, you know. And I think only by entering that space that one can actually go back and as Pratima mentioned, that to question those binaries of secular, religious, and modern, pre-modern, male, female subjects, you know, and to think of them outside this kind of structure agency kind of dichotomies, and to think of them as agentic, the way Saba Mahmoud talks about, you know, agentic, that not agency there is not necessarily defined as resistance. Agency is not defined as kind of reshaping the entire structures of presence and reality, but it's just articulating and engaging with realities that find no place in those already existing points of references. A couple of years ago, a few years ago, I wrote this article on the question of inheritance and abortion in Iran, women's inheritance and abortion, and that goes back to the point you brought up, Lynn, earlier, that why I go back to these kind of modernist indicators, you know, like women are educated, this and that. Of course, I go back there to say that when people say that now women in Iran are the subject of this repressive patriarchal system, they don't even actually, I don't care about those indicators, but I brought them up to say that you don't care about your own indicators. You know, if you say that this is what happens, but you know, look at your own indicator. It's always interesting. I was on the panel that I mentioned this. I said that when people talk about women's situation around the world, they always refer to these indicators: infant mortality, life expectancy, education, and so employments, and so on. So the moment they get to Iran, they say that it's hijab. You know, it's like, so let's be consistent there. You know, if you are interested in that, but you see that these things also have changed, but they've changed not necessarily based on the same kind of point of references. That's the part that I want to highlight, that everybody anticipates that these will be the points of references for women's life changes or transformation of women's condition. Again, I mentioned that piece I wrote on inheritance and abortion rights. There's a whole kind of conversation in the Iranian parliament and the women members of the parliament on how to understand life after conception. You know? And all the references are not to this kind of autonomous post-Enlightenment subject with rights to decide, but the conversation is about how do we envision life in Islamic tradition, all these conversations that are happening, and then the result actually look totally the same, like because they legalized the abortion up to actually the 4th month of conception and pregnancy, and change the inheritance laws. But again, these changes are happening with a different kind of conversation, not necessarily coming from that kind autonomous rational subject of enlightenment. and with references to women's bodies, but there is a totally different kind of conversation that are happening there. On the question of political spirituality, I think I have to mention this, that one of the big pushbacks I got from Foucault scholars about the book was exactly on that point, on political spirituality. Even people who were kind of sympathetic to the Foucauldian project and Foucault's writing on Iran, they thought that this was kind of a off-track kind of little thing that Foucault threw in there, and we shouldn't make too much of that concept. And of course, I think they had that position because they had a different idea about what spirituality is. And as you mentioned, Pratama, that totally, misunderstanding of when we say spiritual, we are not thinking about doctrinal, religious, theological. We are thinking of transformative abilities of self, and how the self is kind of defining him or herself in opposition to the other, who is actually not constituted, and I think that's a very important point you raised, not constituted in contradistinction to that self, and then I try to highlight that this kind of relational, transformative abilities of spirituality there, so in that sense, political spirituality, and I have to say that I'm so glad that just a couple of weeks ago, a new translation of a new piece on political spirituality Foucault wrote in 1980 just came out, and it's the entire essay on political spirituality. So I felt, yes, I'm vindicated. Like this was important to him. And I mean, if you email me, I'll send you this new piece. Yeah, this is a very interesting piece. But I think that that's very important, that neither in terms of spirituality nor in terms of politics, this is not what Foucault is thinking. Politics, when he thinks about the political in that sense, he is being very kind of faithful to his own conception of the political, which relates to the microphysics of of power, rather than kind of state-centered political institutions and struggles and things like that. So it's political spirituality in totally different sense of the words political and spiritual. And I'm afraid I can't really give you a good answer about, so how do I see the very notion of the political, but I think this is really at the core of the conversation. And this is something that I'm really working on now in my new project, that then how is it possible to have a conception of the political without, again, I mentioned that in my little presentation, without being stoic about it, because this is like, I really don't know how to sort of navigate that terrain, because it's very hard not to think of the political in the conventional sense of politics, and then at the same time not to be stoic about it, not to care ontologically about the kinds of political act and political actions that one takes and its consequences and how you deal with that. So let's stay in touch and talk about that, and then we hopefully will get closer to a good definition. And lastly, I want to say a bit about silence. And again, I agree with you that it's hard to, I mean, if Susan Buckmore's explanation is kind of, iffy about Hegel, like Hegel was afraid of Napoleon and then didn't talk about Haiti, like, ooh, okay, that's, and my explanation here also is kind of speculative that why Foucault didn't engage in post-revolutionary politics, and also the frame in which he understands this kind of politics, and silence about the genealogy of these concepts. And I think it's I had the occasion of, there was a book talk at Columbia about this book, and they invited Daniel Defer, who was lifelong partner of Foucault, and it was a very interesting experience to me, because I sort of, the last chapter in the book is very speculative, that I said that there's a connection between Foucault and Iran and the transformation of Foucault's ideas at the end of his life, and about the silence. And so I walked into this office, and Daniel Defoe was there, and then he stood up and gave me a big hug and said, "Thank you so much, for." So first of all, who is this guy? And this is Daniel Defoe, and he said that you are the first one who actually mentioned this, because Foucault was so depressed at the end of his life after this. The way French intellectual community treated him after his writings on the Iranian Revolution, that he felt very, very uncomfortable speaking about it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's sort of, it was kind of surprising to me to hear that. And then, and of course, nowadays in France, the question of Islam comes to French politics every so often, and unfortunately in very sort of antagonistic and hostile way, and this is how the French intellectual community is, and I think partly one can explain that silence in relation to that kind of reaction. And indeed, he wrote one piece, I think I mentioned it in the book, in response to the critics, and he said that I write this only if I write it on masked philosopher. I mean, he didn't even sign his own name. He said masked philosopher, and so I think that's an important kind of point there, and then the question becomes, why doesn't he acknowledge what I argue in the book, that when you are thinking about the hermeneutics of the subject, you're actually thinking about those historical subjects on the streets of Tehran, So why doesn't he make that connection, And so, I mean, I had two different theories about this. One is that he's totally unconscious of the connection, and it's quite possible for us, for all of us, to be that our thoughts be conditioned and informed by events and influences that doesn't register at a very conscious level, but unconsciously it shapes our mind. And possibly he's not really thinking and making these connections. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is that kind of campaign of intimidation, that he doesn't want to make these connections to take away the credibility of his argument. So I don't know. And I think the significance of the Iranian experience is quite important to me. I think that this is like by far the kind of most intensive engagement Foucault had with any historical event, you know, and with these writings and 12 essays and then thinking about it. And but I'm sure that if one delves into like the notion, the concept of silence that he talks about in Japanese Zen Buddhism, for example, I'm sure if one delves into that, you can see the footprint of that kind of practice in his theoretical work as well. I mean, there's so many things there that I want to just stop and again apologize for not addressing your questions and comments in a better way, but I'm more curious now to see what our audiences, if have questions, like three of us can answer those questions.
Thank you, Behrooz. Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions in the chat and I'll read them out. There was also a comment, I think, by Ruchi Chaturvedi, who pointed out the kind of absent presence of Sabah Mahmood in these conversations, and you then did mention her work in your comment. But let me read the three questions that we have. So the first from Shai Gortler. It said, in May 1978, in What is Critique, Foucault uses a negative term to describe a self-defined transformation in subjectivity, desubjectification. In December 1978, after his 2 visits to Iran, Foucault begins to use a positive term to describe such processes, subjectification. What role might his visits to Iran play in this new positive articulation? If monotheistic inspired spiritualities have a fixed version of the essence of man, how can we think of a Nietzschean inspired, non-transcendental subjectivation, through a spiritual lens? Do the texts of the Persian mystic Mansur al-Hallaj gesture towards this direction? That's the first question. The second question.
You guys ask such hard questions.
You said you're going to test us at the end, but you know we're testing you.
So shall I answer the first?
You want to take that? Okay, sure. Let's take that.
Yeah. I totally agree that it's such a marked change in Foucault's writing about the subject and subjectification and subjection from before going to Iran and after his encounter with the Iranian Revolution. And that kind of, I wouldn't call it positive or negative. And you know, a lot of people sort of frame it a little bit differently, which could have like negative or positive implications. But they say that, you know, before Iranian Revolution, of course, people don't say before the Iranian Revolution, after the Iranian Revolution. I say it's before, after, but people talk about, you know, the transformation of Foucault after 1980 and before 1980. They say that when he talks about subject, he's talking about subject as being fabricated. And when he talks about subject after 1980 and 1979, 1980, he talks about the constitutive subject. So in a sense, you know, in later writing, the subject is pretty active. I mean, the difference between being fabricated, which is kind of a very passive generation of subject, to sort of subject being constitutive, meaning having some role in the structuring and formation of their own subjecthood. So in that sense, I think it's so true that this shift happens, and and indeed that might go back to Pratama's point about the question of silence. Foucault was very familiar with Hallaj, and the fact that he doesn't make these kind of references in his writing is curious, and you know, one needs to sort of flag that. He was very familiar with Hallaj and the way Hallaj talks about this kind of the transformation of the self, and he was familiar through the writing of Massignon, perhaps the most significant French Orientalist who wrote about Shiism and spirituality and mysticism. So this was part of his reading list before going to Iran. I had the really by accident the privilege of having a conversation with Paul Veillet, who was a French sociologist and worked in Iran and was very familiar with Iranian politics. And then he told me that what Foucault's, because I was curious that what was Foucault's reading list, you know, what was he reading before going to Iran? And he said that indeed, you know, he delved into Massignon, who is the sort of the most significant scholar of Hallaj. And that's why he was very much influenced by this kind of mystical tradition in Islam. And I mentioned in the book that he was so influenced by that mystical tradition that he totally missed the juridical and doctrinal parts of Islam, which became so significant after the revolution. But that's so true. I mean, there is that connection there, but without sort of being articulated as such in Foucault's work.
Thank you, Behrooz. I'll ask the next question by Ayanda Nombila. I was also fascinated by the idea of political spirituality, and I was thinking how it might connect here in South Africa with the idea of Black consciousness as awareness of the oppression of the Black self and its refashioning towards the same modern subject, but through freedom. One of the positive ideals of the Black consciousness tradition was to provide an imagination beyond the binaries of majority and minority as foundations of the modern nation-state politics, although this does not seem to have gone any further. My question is whether the movement for freedom in Iran, led by this idea of political spirituality, as Michel Foucault suggests to us, a different notion of the state. Does it succeed in proposing a different kind of political living beyond the liberal framework of nation-state, which is Western Enlightenment based? Does the movement in Iran ever culminate into a better notion of freedom?
No. That's the short answer is no. But you know, whenever I think about these issues in writing about the post-revolutionary situation in Iran, inevitably I keep thinking about South Africa, and that connection is very sort of palpable and real to me. That this kind of post-apartheid Africa and post-revolution Iran, and how these sort of imaginative parts of freedom, the imaginative and creative forms of envisioning different kinds of society is undermined by considerations of realpolitik, you know, and it's about land, it's about ownership of the industry, it's about international relations, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think it's the problem is that whether it's possible at all to have a form of state, and that's, I think, this is the big question. Is it possible at all to have a form of state that remains faithful to that imaginative part of emancipatory politics? That indeed was really one of the central elements of the conversation during writing the Iranian constitution after the revolution. How do we make this kind of connection to remain faithful to that kind of imaginative part of emancipatory politics while we sort of establish a new state? You know? Somebody, one of Foucault's critics at the time, told him that how could you be sympathetic to the notion of Islamic State? Doesn't Islam suppresses and creates these forms of patriarchy and this and that? And why do you advocate such thing? And Foucault said that actually I never advocated Islamic State, but because anybody who reads my work should understand that I don't need any kind of adjective before this state, because once I say state, I'm not going to be sympathetic to it, because the government itself is a repressive structure, and you can't even start to think about a question of emancipatory imagination while you're at the same time thinking about the governmental structure and institutions. So I think that's one needs to understand, therefore, that these moments, these transformative moments, are fleeting, and the most lasting effects they have are not reflected in the kind of institutions they establish. The most lasting effect they have is in the new forms of subjectivity that they create. And where does this lead? I don't know. And that, again, that goes back to the very important question Pratima asked, what is politics there then, you know? Because once we enter this kind of formation of new states, state formations, by definition, impose a particular technologies of docility and production and so on and so forth that are not inducive to the ideas of emancipatory politics. I mean, they just wanted to create more forms of techniques of docility rather than freedom. I know it's kind of a pessimistic kind of outlook, but I think that that I'm in that school of political thought that I would consider myself to be an activist pessimist, you know, and because I do truly believe that the act of imaginative politics has emancipatory consequences for the subject. So I can't even imagine not to be there in that experience, but I also can't imagine to have that kind of expectation that kind of participation suddenly creates an institutions at the state level, maybe at the local level possible, that would be the embodiment of that kind of emancipatory politics. And anyhow, that's my response.
Thanks, Behrooz.
If Lynn and Pratima want to add something, please.
Sure, just feel free to jump in. I think in that interview you referred to also in the book where he described in that moment doesn't talk about alternatives, but about dangers or things that are dangerous. Right? Yeah, let me read the next question from Callie Gillespie. I'm so interested by your formulation, Behrooz, that the possibility of the Iranian Revolution rested on the condition of solidarity across difference. So often our political work is informed by the idea that if we want to get anything serious accomplished in the political field, we have to forego complexity, make hard essentializing decisions, choose single issues. Solidarity is also something that has come to be understood in many political spaces as one of the most difficult political feats, something that might even be impossible given our current insistence on the necessity of personal experience in any legitimate political claim. Can you tell us something about how that notion of solidarity was made possible, articulated in the revolution, as something that might help us through our current troubles with solidarity?
One of the big issues that historians of the Iranian Revolution always talk about is how Khomeini's leadership actually was based on the suppression of these kind of differences. And they always mention this, that Khomeini always, in his sermons and political speeches, he always talked about wahdat kalame, the unity of our words. And I always say that this is an interesting kind of concept that if someone is talking about unity of our words, in a sense, that also is an implicit and possibly explicit acknowledgement of difference. I mean, if you are not thinking about differences, why would you emphasize so much that we have to have a unity of our differences? It's again the same issue that Pratama mentioned about Tawheed and this unity that could be read in very contradictory ways. That the unity can mean this is the basic principle of monotheism in Islam, the unity of God. There's only one God, and that's Tawheed. But at the same time, you can read that to say that because there are so many varieties of species and beings and in this world, we need to think about how to create a world in which that all these diversities can coexist. So unity in that sense is not the rejection of differences. Unity in that sense is the acknowledgement of differences. And this is how I think one needs to understand the question of solidarity. And what one thing that was quite important in the Iranian Revolution that sustained that unity was that the revolution actually operated based on a negative dialectics, and it was always about negation, and in so many different ways, negation always also covers up the differences that might be detrimental to unity. Because you say that you stay at the very general level. For example, people say, we are all for justice, but how we define justice, is a very big question, and whenever there was a demonstration and people started arguing after demonstration in Tehran in 1978, 79, and there was a slogan that people chanted, "Bahs bad az marg Shah," argument after the death of the Shah, So you don't want to sort of bring to surface these differences at that time, and just continue to operate in that negative dialectic of rejection rather than affirmation of what needs to be done. And but I think that kind of politics, perhaps, I'm not quite sure, don't quote me on this one, it just should stay between us here, that might have something to do with the specific period of the time that kind of negative dialectic was possible to envision. Pretty much like the tail end of anti-colonial liberation movements that envision a very large kind of political projects. And by the emergence of this kind of neoliberal world, that became more and more difficult to sustain that kind of sort of grand projects of political liberation. And possibly this kind of questions of identity and in a form that essentializes the forms of identity became very detrimental to the formation of those kind of large possibilities of solidarity. But these are, we don't know. I mean, I say this, that's why I say that don't quote me on this, because at the same time, I'm very much against this kind of periodization. So I don't want to say that there was a period there and then that ended, and now we pretty much is likely that we enter the same kind of period very soon, if you are not already there, of this kind of grand kind of political bargains and that allows different kinds of solidarity to operate. So yeah. Anyway, that's
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Behrooz.
Any other questions I can't answer?
We're really exhausting your generosity here. But I mean, in closing, I would just want to perhaps ask you one question, which is in the opening, in the preface, about writing about this as an experience through which you yourself were a participant in many ways. And I think there are a number of scholars and students and in the different parts of the world that this project is connected to, that also in some ways are grappling with those predicaments of these moments, and how one thinks back on these moments. And I just wondered if you just wanted to say a little bit about that.
Of course, that's it is interesting to me that whenever I am engaged in these kind of conversations, then there are all these series of connections that emerge through these conversations. And I just so happen to know a little bit about South African politics, for example. And actually, last time I was there in Cape Town, I visited the library at the university, and I was curious to see if there were any kind of archives about Iranian Revolution there. And there I realized that actually the Iranian Revolution has so much impact on South African politics, because, as you know, the Shah's regime was the main supplier of energy to South African apartheid regime, and one of the very, very first things that the post-revolutionary regime did was to cut off all the relations with apartheid regime in South Africa. So there's an energy crisis in South Africa because of the Iranian Revolution, and these kind of connections are so fascinating. And I'm sure that one can think about these forms of engagement, and now I can't really get that out of my mind about the conception of politics, and it's all Pradhan's fault. that emerges from these kind of conversations, And I want to be faithful to what I said earlier, to be very empirical about it, to think contextually about these notions, rather than coming up with rather than operating in a conceptual universe. We should really enter these kind of conversations that allows us to see how things operate in reality, and how they open up different kinds of spaces in which we can make these connections, and through which we can come up with these kind of concepts that would facilitate different ways of seeing the world. And I'm really serious about what I said at the beginning of my presentation, that I think when I think about my book or whatever I do here in my job is really trying to think about what other possible ways can we see the world. It's a huge claim, but if you don't have that in mind, then you be very dismissive of different possibilities that people are opening up on the ground, and thinking about their own world. And I'm partly through these events that you organize, and this whole new movement on theory from the South connections. These are, I think, very, very important, because unlike the way we think of theory in its grand frame and version, this kind of theoretical argument are very much grounded and rooted, and it gives legitimacy to people's experiences, and the way they're generative in the way that we see the world. Anyhow, I think now suddenly I realize that in the chat part you can see a lot of things. Although I teach now through Zoom, and I know there's a chat thing there, but I kind of was not paying attention to that anymore.
That's okay. I think we were also talking before we started about the ways in which Zoom meetings are consuming our lives, but I have to say I'm ambivalent after these kinds of experiences, where we can have a conversation with you, Behrooz, in the US, and Fatima in India, and then in Kampala, and save on airfare and carbon footprint. And I think it's really been a feast, and I think the honored to have had the three of you here with us to present in the final of this series of the Other Universal seminars for the year. And we definitely will want to invite Len and Fatima next year to present when we return and start the academic year. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And again, I want to thank you again. And I don't know how many people I know in Cape Town are watching today, but I just want to send greetings to all the people I know, and if they're part of the audience there, and hope to see all of you sometime soon in person.
Thanks, Behrooz. And we definitely would want to bring you here.
Thank you. Hi, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. And I also just want to thank Sepideh Azari and Ali Rida Khan and Gareth Campbell, who have taken care of all the logistics and publicity and so on for all of the seminars, and we have been able to carry them off without a hitch. So thank you very much to the three of you for putting that together and educating those of us who are really technologically challenged. Although I feel much better now, I at least know there's a chat. Thanks.
All right, goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Yeah.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
stop recording.